Okay, so welcome everyone to today's session. It's really exciting to see all of you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation after Luke's amazing presentation. So I will introduce Luke in a second, but before, so Luke will present his paper, Extract and Abandon, Surplus Value and Surplus Population in Adler-Bolton and Vierkant as Communism. And I will introduce Luke in a second. Before, Joanna, if you want to say a couple of words about upcoming events and about the website and Twitter. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Ariana. I am Joanna. I am a member of the steering committee of this group, and I will now post 3 links, and I will go through them very quickly. So the links are now in the chat. So the first one is the website of the Marxism and Disability Network. I'll just open it myself. So this is the website that we'll use for future events, as well as any call for papers or anything that's relevant and that members would like to put forward and organize either through the network or through some other spaces. So as you will see on the website, we've got the monthly events. We've got events for the whole of 2023 and others coming up in the next year, as well as references. So if you I think I've sent like a form to the mailing list, but basically if anyone wishes to add, we don't have any yet at the moment, but if you wish to add references related to disability and Marxism that you think other visitors to the website should be aware of, please send them through to myself and I'll put them up. Secondly, we've got a Twitter account, and Twitter has been down today quite a bit, so hopefully you'll get the chance to follow it, and we'll put there again announcements about future events. And then finally, I would like to give a very quick shout out to a new call for papers that I've put out via the British Sociological Association. If you're interested in contributed to an event in November about the relationship between rest, work and activism through the lens of disability politics, please check out that website and consider potentially submitting an abstract. I think I'll leave it there. Ariana, if there's anything else that we need to give an update on, please do.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joanna, for creating Twitter account and the website, which it's really exciting to have. And yeah, please, should you have any reference, please send them over, so Joanna will upload them. Yeah, I think that's all. And yeah, and the call for paper looks amazing. So yeah, looking forward to that event coming up too. Okay, so yeah, I think we can get started, and maybe a very tiny point. Over the past months, we had problems with, I know that emails didn't get out to everyone, so hopefully we are solving that problem. But should you notice that you were not receiving communication from us over the past couple of months, just let me know, so we can build a picture of what was happening. Yeah, okay, so this said, we can now move to the presentation for today, which is super exciting, and I've been looking forward to this presentation since Luke said he would be able to present. So I will introduce Luke, and then I will pass over to him. So Luke is a doctoral candidate at the Center of Applied Philosophy, Politics and Ethics at the University of Brighton, the secretary of the Disabled Members Network in Acorn, a Union for the Community, a development worker at the Disabled People's Archive in Manchester, and a professional certificate candidate in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Liverpool. and he's not sure what he is most of the time. Yeah, so thanks so much, Luke, and yeah, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ariana, and thanks, Joanna and Paul, for doing the organizing part of this meeting. So this talk is going to be a little bit different from those of previous sessions in that it's not a presentation of my ongoing research, but it's an attempt to address recent work relevant to our shared project of incorporating Marxism and radical disability theory. So what I'm talking about tonight is Beatrice Adler-Bolton and Artie Vierkant's Health Communism, which was published 5 months ago, and is in many senses a novel and willfully polemical intervention, focused as much on the politics it seeks to inspire as by its claims to solve theoretical problems. Tonight, then, is a work in progress, as any engagement with new projects, conceptual frameworks, and methods always is. The owl of Minerva only flies when she feels like it and all that. I'm going to be specifically looking at 2 categories formulated by Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, surplus and extractive abandonment, respectively, which seek to replace, or at least radically amend, conceptual tools in the classical Marxian analysis of disablement, and I'm going to compare these new concepts with the originals. The point of this talk is, I think, purely practical. If the author's conceptual innovations explain more or open up better strategic insights than the ones that we have, we should adopt them wholesale. If they don't, we at least have an opportunity to test out our tools on the new material, which inspires theoretical divergences from us. I think the latter is going to be closer to the truth, although I'm happy to be proved wrong either by events or by convincing counter-arguments from you guys. But I believe we should take every opportunity to sharpen our theoretical tools when we are often simply content to jealously defend them. I've just switched slide. If you haven't seen that, please let me know. I've had some disasters with this in the past. So what I usually work on will, of course, color my interpretation of new frameworks and also my instinctive responses to certain claims. So to be upfront, my PhD is on the generation of political and social theory within Britain's disabled people's movements, and particularly on the distinct socialist and republican tradition spearheaded by the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, or UPIAS. Politically and theoretically, I'm committed to what I, paraphrasing Jairus Banerjee, will call anti-reductionist Marxism. Basically, I believe that historical and dialectical materialism cannot offer explanations in the form of simple categories. While those may serve as rational or even real abstractions in speculative logics or analytic models of the mode of production, emergent social phenomena can only be understood in dynamic contexts that these models cannot explain. Ultimately, I believe UPIAS's social definition of disability, which is based on a dynamic theorization of capitalism's unfolding and is distinct from later, quote, social models, provides the basis for a theory of that type. But however I may try to distinguish my Marxism and my sphere of British disability theory from all the competitor varieties, the fact is I come from 2 sectarian traditions with bad argumentative habits and paranoias about innovation. I'll mention some of those bad habits here for 2 reasons: to make explicit the arguments I am trying to make from the bad ones that you might expect me to, and to encourage you guys to shoot me down if I revert to type. So the first thing I want to avoid is arguing that the flaw in anyone else's argument is that it's not Marxist enough, or it doesn't hold to an orthodox enough reading of the social definition as I see it. Such objections are circular and cliquish, and they presume access to a universal, infallible science, which we demonstrably do not have. Much of health communism takes inspiration from revisions to the Marxist tradition via Deleuze, Gortz, etc., and that itself is not grounds for skepticism. Secondly, I don't want to get squeamish about discussing disablement and health in terms other than those of medicalization and domination. It's absurd to think that health is a less complex social relationship than others British disability theory does treat as nuance, and frankly, avoiding the topic gifts it to our opponents in ways that have come back to bite us in the backside. I'll argue that health communism's formulation of health as foundational to disablement overcorrects this error, but it should be read charitably as a correction. Finally, I want to avoid taking the form in which something appears as explaining its process of production and reproduction. If types of oppression or commodification encapsulate broader social dynamics, that's because they reveal social relations external to them, not because they sum everything up. I think Adler-Bolton and Vierkant fall prey to this error to some degree by using rich and accurate descriptive accounts to generalize broader dynamics, but frankly, it's endemic in contemporary Marxist analyses, and we need to front up to it. I'll return to this point briefly at the end of the talk, when hopefully its implications will be a little clearer. Now, that aside, the structure of this is going to be quite segmented and quite linear. I'll firstly give an overview of the broad argument of health communism, indicating why we should take it seriously, alongside my reservations about its core claims. I'll then get into the conceptual analysis, outlining what I take to be the classical version of Marxian concepts in disability movement literature, and then their reformulation in Adler-Bolton and Vierkant's work. The reformulations put forward advance and rely on structural claims, which I'll test against what I believe to be sufficiently broad and meaningful best pictures of disabled people's position in capitalism today. Structural claims, after all, should be able to predict trends and response types among social actors, even if not outcomes, and so empirical testing appears appropriate. As health communism is primarily concerned with inspiring radical social movements, I'll also look at the kinds of strategic orientation these new concepts might encourage, and how these scrub up against their predecessors. My conclusions will be critical, but hopefully in a way that's comradely and constructive. So we'll get going with the broad argument of why, for Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, health is such a central and precarious relationship for capitalism, why, in the first sentence of their introduction, they refer to it as, quote, capitalism's vulnerability. Health, of course, predates capital. It's something that individuals aspire to, what Aristotle postulated as a body's virtue or arate, and as something managed at the level of populations, as we see clearly from dietary codes and ritual cleanliness in ancient Semitic traditions. In each case, health is treated as a property of the individual, so I aspire to virtue through care of my body, and I am deficient if I fail, while its contents are transparently defined by social projects over which most people have little control, such as war and peace or the maintenance of priestly castes. Capital's great innovation for the authors is taking this bifurcatory category of personal virtue and transforming it into the mechanism of social inclusion and exclusion. For capital, health defines legitimate absence from work in a society where labor is, putatively at least, the basis for social citizenship. It does this at a high price, exposing the unhealthy both to the moral reprimands of yore and to dependency on the largesse of society as a whole, a largesse which is kept at a miserly level by decisions made by the ruling class. This division delimits the labor force, moderating oversupply, and undermines both the bargaining power of workers who look on the lot of the unhealthy with horror and cling to what meager health their wages will buy, as well as solidarity across all layers of the oppressed, as the unhealthy are made parasitic on workers' work, and their immediate material interests will appear divergent. Enforcing and managing this dichotomy is a sufficient condition for statehood, according to Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, and the state will export or withhold any tools it owns to manage health, to promote extraction and unequal exchange abroad. All the while, capital will devise ways to exploit the unhealthy for profit, as we'll see later. But the bottom-up interest in health maintains it as a contested sphere. Put simply, those of us who are disabled or are ill are unlikely to be happy with the artificial scarcity forced onto us, either in the rationing of direct healthcare or in the material things we need to maintain good health, such as clean water, decent housing, nutritious food, and so on. The demand for better and more health will come into conflict with capital's need to divide and exploit its subjects, and with the interests of the medical industry who benefit from scarcity. The more we demand that society marshal its powers to provide health as a right, the less vigorous and rosy-cheeked capitalism becomes. The demand for health as a radical abundance, then, characterized as, quote, all care for all people, is therefore, for Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, a revolutionary demand in and of itself, one which, if successful, would end capitalism. Building projects around this demand cultivate a reimagination of political economy as an organizing tool for the society we want, rather than a set of rules we must live by. Thus, health becomes the site of prefigurative politics in the immediate term, and revolution as a practical project. There are reasons to be excited about this intervention. Firstly, to borrow terms from Vic Finkelstein, this is a transformational argument, not an inclusivist one. It does not demand that disabled people be given a seat at the table in a burning house. but that their position be a jumping off point for building the world differently. Secondly, and rarely in either disability studies or contemporary Marxist analyses, health communism recognizes that sectoral interests exist and that they can determine class struggle and wider social contradictions. As stressed in parts of the book that I can only touch on tonight, medical professionals are not theorized as empty tools for social control within the analysis, nor, as is sometimes postulated, are they seen as bourgeois ideologues who only incidentally work for a wage. But instead, they are thought of as social actors with a specific position which compels them to fight for particular interests. Thirdly, the paths to communism that we think of today still often rely on assumptions of class power that simply haven't aged well. When labour is de-skilled, atomized, or both, we should be open to any and all strategies for building a real movement to abolish the existing state of things. And clearly, many people are open to Adler-Bolton and Vierkant's analysis, with the first printing of Health Communism selling out within a week. But I think skepticism is warranted. I'm sure some of us got a sense of déjà entendu during the previous slides. We've heard, perhaps equally plausible, claims that race and gender, not to mention class, are the divisions that structure capitalism, and that its mechanisms of control can be read back as their unique functions. We may also have heard similar claims of capitalism relying on agriculture, law, unpaid domestic work, or policing in ways such that their reclaiming by the oppressed would lead to its downfall. Is health really special, or, following Sartre and Lefebvre, does capitalism rely on a vast array of distinct social activities mediated by labour to reproduce itself? If the latter, then this is the source of its strength as well as its precarity, as it shifts its demands from sector to sector, institution to institution, whenever one sphere of social life gets too spicy for it. The varieties of capitalism school applied an analysis like this to socialized medicine, arguing that, at least under specific conditions, bourgeois states are incentivized by high investment costs and labor shortages to universalize large swathes of care faster than health activists can demand it, in the process effectively demobilizing those health movements. Adler-Bolton and Vierkant's response to this position, that states who follow this process, quote, remain capitalist and imperialist, close quote, reads more like a description of their opponent's position than a substantive objection to it. Finally, there's an incentive mismatch between revolutionary aims and care as their primary focus. Adler-Bolton and Vierkant mean revolution when they say it. They and I suspect most of us in this Zoom call, want the overthrow of capital's dictatorship, peacefully if we may, and forcibly if we must. But revolutions are uncontroversially bad for civilian health in the short and medium term, for the obvious reasons that collapsed states mean collapsed infrastructure, and that the civil wars which so often follow revolutions divert medical resources to war aims while maiming and killing on a mass scale. A revolutionary health movement, then, will always be in a bind over taking revolutionary initiative, which will likely be a willful sacrifice of its program for at least the revolutionary period, if not longer. This problem is not unique to health-focused movements, and acting in direct contradiction to your demands in your program is likely to be implied even for the most workerist of revolutionary projects. But this problem is posed in an acute form when we ask revolutionary fighters to sacrifice their health for the sake of health, rather than for, say, freedom, justice, workers' power, or any of the old slogans. Now I want to move on to the core concept underpinning health communism, that of surplus, or that part of the population who are radically excluded and devalued, and by this separation, condition exploitation and domination for everyone, becoming, quote, nothing and everything to capital. But first, we need to take a detour through Marx and UPIAS to see how a concept of relative superfluity has informed disability politics in the past. A relative surplus population, or a group of people cast out from the dominant employment relationship, develops for Marx and Engels from the central crisis tendency of capitalism. Simply put, when the value of machines and equipment in the production process grows faster than the value created by labor, or what Marx called the rising organic composition of capital, employers will lay off workers and avoid hiring new ones. Workers of certain types, low and middle skill, unadaptable to new machines, too demanding of accommodations, and so forth, are effectively placed on the scrap heap, rendered unnecessary to capitalist production, and forced into demeaning and precarious means to get their own necessities. This surplus population is relative in three senses. First, it moves with the organic composition of capital. When fixed capital is devalued, surplus population shrink, and this means that its size will vary over time, and thus some people will be in it for shorter periods than others. Second, it is relative to wage labor. Being made surplus doesn't make you a non-worker automatically. It limits the extent you can reproduce yourself and access social citizenship through labor. In Engels' famous description of the Salford slums, the surplus population not only begs and steals, but equally relies on precarious self-employment, such as carriage driving, and the most unhealthy, ad hoc, and unpleasant forms of part-time work, cleaning jobs for the local council, plus ça change. Third, this population is stratified among itself. For some low-skilled workers, their position as surplus will be lengthy but temporary, and it will contain quasi-stable access to the wage fund, perhaps a slew of part-time service gigs. For others, superfluity will define their whole lives. In what I believe to be the only accurate and substantive charge of disablism against Marx, he places disabled people in the lowest category of this taxonomy, effectively arguing that no development in capitalism could possibly make use of their creative potential once they have been excluded. For all that, they and the rest of the relative surplus population are a part of the working class, subjected to the dynamics of its domination and to its devaluation under conditions of crisis. UPIAS made an important revision to Marx's analysis. They argued, I believe convincingly, that disability oppression begins independently of the crisis dynamic. Instead of looking at the relative values of capital and labor, we can identify disability exclusion in the material relationships of the workplace, or what Marx called the, quote, technical composition of capital, probably best simplified as who is doing what with what gear to make what or provide what service. Changing the equipment or management strategies in workplaces will exclude less adaptable workers, regardless of whether these alterations contribute to or respond to crisis tendencies. Disabled people are thus made vulnerable to changes in workplace management or techniques, even in boom periods, although, as UPIAS pointed out in their first policy document, crises will make their situation much, much worse. Changes in productive forces can, paradoxically, also play a reintegrating role for some disabled workers. Machines and workflow management can make work lighter as well as heavier, and new use values can reproduce disabled people's labor power more efficiently outside of the workplace, effectively allowing some reintegration into labor markets at low or no cost to employers. These benefits are, however, unlikely to be evenly spread and will be mediated by forms of extra economic domination, which we'll get into shortly. These insights led UPIAS to suggest that disabled people were not bunched at one end of the surplus population, but that they would experience the full range of its outcomes, although underrepresented at the top of its taxonomy. There will be relatively few disabled workers who are frequently, if precariously employed, and only temporarily surplus. For Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, surplus is a much more expansive category, quote, amorphous and indefinable, close quote, and, at least potentially, incorporating all human life, but with disablement as a core element, the lens through which it is most easily observed. In the absence of functional definitions in health communism, certain traits are identified as essential to the surplus and to the role it plays for capital. Firstly, contra Marx and UPIAS, the surplus is not part of the working class, but radically separated from it, one half of a, quote, worker surplus binary, close quote, which structures capitalist societies. The surplus is then a category constitutive, but not exhausted by the role health plays for capital. The marking of this group as unnecessary to capital entails both a value judgment about their right to live a fulfilling life, or indeed their right to live at all, and a sacrifice of their social rights as these are policed by wage labor and state policies. They encapsulate the disciplining role health imposes on workers, obscuring class consciousness while being the raw material for both various health markets and the state's rationing of public funds. It's not entirely clear what kind of binary is being set up between the surplus and workers. Adler-Bolton and Vierkant often describe this separation as a mirage in ways that obscure more than they reveal. Sometimes the mirage claim refers to the belief that class interests are incompatible between the groupings, a belief resolved by the fact that both would benefit from communism. I'm going to out myself now in respectable company, and I beg you all to please forgive me, but in my work, I'm on the lower range of management. Both I and the people I manage would certainly be better off under communism, and please God one day, but it strikes me that that doesn't help us figure out if our current situation involves a binary. Secondly, the mirage claim is used to advance the surplus as a possible universal subject. Workers are conditioned by the surplus's existence now, and we all become surplus when we stop working. So it may make sense for workers to start thinking and acting like surplus in the knowledge that they will one day become it, and in some sense are. Again, a child's life will be conditioned by the existence or otherwise of her parents and grandparents, and she will hopefully grow up to be old herself. I don't think that tells us if generational binaries exist within the family, or what that might mean if they do. I've come up with two, I hope generous, interpretations of the binary claim. In the first, it would describe a material relation of is and is not. In this version, the surplus does not work, or only works in insignificant numbers, and workers are not surplus, at least while they remain workers. In the second interpretation, the distinction is closer to a mirage. It's a form of false consciousness that is, presumably, enforced by the state, which polices the binary. If this is true, and the binary really does structure capitalism, we'd expect states to entrench it in every intervention they make into industrial and welfare policy. And I'm just going to have a wee sip of water. Okay, so unfortunately, the first interpretation of the surplus not working and the workers not being surplus is empirically implausible. Any of you who caught Comrade Joanna's Brighton talk last week will have an insight into disabled people's relationship with bad work, precarious, underpaid, and unpleasant, rather than categoric unemployment. Joanna's insights and observations are supported by the admittedly flawed official employment statistics, which show disability employment rates converging around the 45 to 55% mark in developed imperialist nations, with categoric exclusion only visible in post-colonial and oppressed countries, those where foreign capital demands frequent firm restructuring, and also the underdevelopment of domestic industries. Of course, these figures overcount relative to the economically inactive, those disabled people so fed up with fruitless job searches that they've stopped bothering looking, but they simultaneously undercount the proportion of the inactive in informal waged work, and those disabled people who normally make whatever living they can from wage labour, but are unemployed at the time of counting. And that's always a highish number in any precarious sector. Of the numbers counted, however, the character of the work that we as disabled people do is clear, with appallingly high rates of short contract and piecework, poverty wages, and unpaid overtime, which Joanna's work details much further. The picture, as far as we can tell, is not absolute separation of disabled people from workers, but an unequally high share for disabled people in all of the working class's miseries. At first blush, the second interpretation seems more plausible. Those of us who've survived the austerity period and the corresponding war on disabled people, to quote Ellen Clifford, are acutely aware of capitalist states' reliance on sharp, arbitrary distinctions between the legitimately, quote, needy and, quote, shirkers to justify attacks on the working class as a whole. My conjecture is that such distinctions, at least as a basis for policy, are strategies employed opportunistically, not essential and persisting structures of capitalist states as such. I believe a substantial, albeit singular, piece of evidence for this view is disability welfare policy in Britain's initial, or what's called its classic, post-war welfare state, a 21-year period where no worker surplus binary can be discerned in the administration of cash payments. Put simply, Britain had a two-tier system of disability benefits, one so inadequate that it inspired the first disabled people-led mass movement in this country, but which avoided erecting barriers to labour market entry or legitimising forms of non-work. For disabled military personnel and industrial workers, or the Crip aristocracy, generous extra cost payments facilitated labour market re-entry and crucially would not end when the claimant got a new job. For everybody else, a single discretionary income replacement served disabled and non-disabled people alike, with arbitrary local administrations preventing any centralised labour market strategy. As the policy historian Jamil Hampton has pointed out, for this long period of welfare state expansion, the British government did not police distinctions between disabled and other workers, disabled people and other workers, but instead prevented that emerging distinctions did not exist to avoid increasing welfare expenditure. When a mass welfare movement did arise in opposition to the status quo, demanding a universal income for all disabled people by right, policies that reintroduced an administrative distinction between disabled people and workers became the state's distant second preference. To cut a long political story short, the 1971 pivot to income replacement benefits turned out to be the state's least worst option after failed attempts to tinker around the existing system, and it was certainly not a choice that the state would have made without activist pressure. The facts and cases I've outlined are handled better by the UPIAS formulation than those of health communism. The employment situation is, overall, roughly what UPIAS's position would predict it be, and the state responding to, rather than creating, distinctions within the working class is consistent with an analysis of capitalism led more by organic changes in production than by political diktat. Of course, I picked the examples, and I happen to agree with UPIAS on this, so I wouldn't blame anyone for skepticism that this exhausts all possible discussions. Regardless, these examples reveal difficulties for anyone looking to Adler-Bolton and Vierkant's work for a guide to social movement strategy. Firstly, there are clearly struggles to be had around disability and work. On the strongest reading of the binary claim, these are effectively denied as a possibility. On the weaker version, some ideological intervention is possible, but seems tangential to health communism's overall project of reframing anti-capitalist struggles as health ones and vice versa. Secondly, if the example from Britain in the 60s is to be taken seriously, the worker surplus binary turns out to be an essential over the long haul, something that can be dispensed with by state actors when conditions allow, with our oppression as disabled people persisting regardless. I suspect, and we may wish to assess this further, that we may be now experiencing such a shift in British welfare policy. Furthermore, and perhaps more troublingly, the reform movements against the unacceptable status quo in the post-war welfare state were a significant factor in embedding the legal division that Adler-Bolton and Vierkant describe, despite significant similarities between their strategic orientation. Disabled reformers at the time demanded, as health communism would urge them to, a total decoupling of disablement and austerity. What they got instead was a worker surplus binary written into the law. I'll now move on to extractive abandonment, which, like surplus, occupies a thicker role in health communism's analysis of capitalism than theories of exploitation did in older movement literature. For Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, extraction of economic value from the disabled surplus is nothing less than the capitalist state's construction of itself and its national economy through a manipulation and commodification of its subjects as demographic types. Again, I'll start with the older activist framework to show what exactly is being departed from and what is new. For the old activist tradition, disability exclusion expands with the real subsumption of everyday life by capital. Not only are disabled people relatively excluded from the productive sphere, and thus from the commodity markets and social citizenship it grants access to, but a, quote, typical worker, close quote, becomes the design ideal for public space and administration as these adapt to facilitating wage labor. With reversing this process, or on the other hand, active genocide against disabled people, economic and political impossibilities respectively, the state charges some strata of civil society to manage this social problem of exclusion for it through bespoke hospitals, homes, rehabilitative and community services. This strata operates largely as a parastate, almost entirely dependent on the state proper for funding and facilitative legislation, but held at arm's length from policy or financial decision-making. Which section of civil society gets this work is largely a matter of political wrangling, based firstly on who actually wants it, and secondly on who causes the state least bother by their way of doing the job. As Paul Hunt noted, during times of social contestation and economic expansion, new entrants disrupt the sphere in search of status and funding, often incorporating disabled activists' demands into their practice to undermine their competitors. This picture changes during crises of profitability, where entrenched actors defend the status quo while their prestige and resources diminish, as Ken Davis's work in the late 80s and early 90s describes vividly. In both cases, however, actors in the, quote, disability industry rely on opportunity hoarding to win and sustain their own position. depriving disabled people of autonomy and life opportunities to establish spheres of professional activity and influence through effective monopolization. Following Weber rather than Marx, movement theorists describe this as a form of exploitation specific to the construction of social problems and their management, or in short, a form of extra economic domination. The departure from this analysis in health communism reflects a material shift in the economic basis of the disability industry. Instead of selecting its preferred management case and then paying them directly through funded positions and NGOs, imperialist states have largely adopted a hands-off approach to long-term service provision for the last 30 years, establishing market mechanisms which minimize contact between providers and policymakers, and replacing negotiated policy outcomes with profit as a condition for continued market access. Paradoxically, then, those excluded from the labour force, and thus incapable of generating surplus value, become the objects of value extraction through their, to quote Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, own set of profitable industries. In the first instance, this occurs through their subjection to for-profit nursing homes, rehabilitation services, private hospitals, and pharmaceutical businesses, infrastructure which disabled people, as well as many other people, have no choice but to use, and which dominates their life opportunities in pursuit of maximum profit. In the second instance, the financialization of these industries entails the commodification of the lives, deaths, and living conditions of the disabled surplus as tradable financial assets, shares, derivatives, debt trades, etc., with financial market incentives trumping all others in setting the limits for sectoral reform. Through establishing and subsidizing this process, the state makes itself as a state, for Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, establishing and managing regimes of accumulation as a state sine qua non, and simultaneously secures the economic growth and circulation of financial capital, which keeps the capitalist system going, stabilizing an unstable system. Adler-Bolton and Vierkant do us a profound service by making the private sector central to disability oppression. This shift to market rather than parastate mechanisms in organizing our separation cannot but impact the dynamics of our oppression, and it has been appallingly under-theorized in both movement literature and much of the academic writing. I have misgivings, however, that extraction or abandonment capture this shift fully, or whether the state's relationship to the providers and victims of this process are really consistent with Adler-Bolton and Vierkant's claims about economic growth. We first, I think, need to be clear on where value is extracted from and how much of it actually ends up as profit, a picture which I believe is much more heterogeneous than the one the authors paint of marketization up until this point. So most funding for the industries Adler-Bolton and Vierkant list come directly or indirectly from the state in the form of cash transfers, subsidized research and development, or tax subsidies. The authors correctly characterize this as a giant public bung to private business, but its implications are that value is largely extracted from the tax revenues of the population as a whole, not the surplus in particular. Secondly, and despite these extensive subsidies, the state is not always the active force pushing people into for-profit segregated services. Plenty of incentives exist for families and employers to pressure older people, people with mental distress, or those with addiction issues into for-profit care, with the state merely playing facilitator and regulator in these processes. This passive role is also indicated by market failures further down the chain, with institutional providers benefiting from the state's unwillingness to intervene on behalf of competitors offering cheaper community-based services. Finally, there continues to exist a section of the market that doesn't look extractive at all, with luxury and culturally or religiously specific services making a tidy profit from the market choices of the better off. There are also significant questions about whether these industries are profitable enough to add meaningfully to economic growth, or in many cases, whether they're profitable at all. Of those listed by Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, only alcohol and drug rehabilitation services and pharmaceuticals make seriously healthy returns, no pun intended. Care and nursing homes are, at least in much of the world, notoriously unprofitable, even when the most hideous and impersonal economies of scale are applied. So to take an example which those of us living in Britain are probably most familiar with, of the big four residential care providers who manage, I think it's now up to about 45%, 50% of the overall market, the last count. One reported a significant loss in profits last financial year, while another reported profits significantly below their immediate reinvestment costs. A third declined to publish accounts at all, but slashed their CEO's pay by 3/4, a sign that there may be trouble at mill. Problems are likely even more acute for smaller providers, still the majority in most countries, who lack economies of scale or easy access to investment markets. Private hospitals fare slightly better, but are restructuring into monopsonous markets, or markets with one dominant buyer, in much of Western Europe, and so will become increasingly vulnerable to state price setting in their wealthier markets. There also remains a significant section in these industries which is constitutionally not-for-profit, in the form of charities, community interest companies, etc., and which, despite adopting competitive practices to survive, cannot easily amortize their users or assets. In residential care, these providers are a respectable minority, around 15% of British homes at my count, and largely represented by large charities which have been around for decades and show no immediate signs of being dislodged. In disability rehabilitation, their market share is likely to be higher, with impairment-specific rehabilitation charities holding an entrenched position which favors them relative to new market entrants. My own suspicion is that the marketization of segregated facilities is less a project to make the unprofitable profitable or to establish new engines of growth, and much more a haphazard attempt at economic rationalization by the state, one where it basically sets its own prices for social goods and hopes that it doesn't have to intervene further. That all but the most corrupt, financially complicated, or residual services would struggle to deal with this policy choice was predicted by Bob Hudson and Mark Priestley, respectively, at the point when marketization began in earnest. I'm inclined to believe that history has borne out their expectations, although, of course, intentions don't stand for anything, for everything, and it's perfectly possible that many of the factors that Adler-Bolton and Vierkant point out could have been achieved without the state meaning to do so. This remains a murky market, and I'm tentative about making too many claims about its internal workings further than I have already tonight. The question still remains of what is to be done in the present. How can we, as disabled people, confront a vast segregated sector in ways that build power and support broader struggles? Here, health communism agrees to a considerable extent with the previous movement. The self-activity of disabled people, providing support to each other on their own terms, provides the space to build skills and practical knowledge which break the monopoly of exploitative and segregated provision, while expanding radical social critique through support networks and building an institutional position to intervene in class struggle. I'm not convinced, however, that we necessarily need an account of extractive abandonment to do that, or that there aren't circumstances in which it would prove potentially unhelpful. The exploitation account that I outlined earlier, for example, provides a reasonably clean matrix for decisions about coalition building around self-organized movements. So you can use it to answer questions like, who should I work with, and under what conditions are people likely to begin to vacillate? How should I get rid of them, etc. Even if, in practice, movement leaderships were often squeamish about using it. Adding a category like extraction appears to complicate that picture. It's difficult to think of a circumstance in which extraction and exploitation wouldn't go together. So it seems to be adding another category really without a necessity for it. With the material insights into opponents' and allies' incentives or frames of action being perfectly well covered by the previous categorization. So I want to end with a quote from Marx from the Grundrisse, the claim that, quote, "The concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the diverse." I think the primary methodological difference between health communism and the Marxian strand of the disabled people's movement, reflected in the critiques I've made today, is that of where one's analysis starts. For Adler-Bolton and Vierkant, we begin always with the excluded in order to center it as a social and political subject with agency. The political merits of this are up for debate, and again, it's one of those things that I think is a correction, albeit possibly an overcorrection for what's gone before. But theoretically, it does rather force us to reconstruct an analysis of capitalism around what we know about marginal positions which we may or may not occupy. The alternative, which I think is what Marx is gesturing at here, is to start with capitalism as a contradictory totality and to use it to try and explain our marginality. This implies a much more heterogeneous and provisional analysis, one where our position is determined by a variety of contradictions and the half fixes applied to them either by ourselves or by various capitalist institutions. Recently, attempts have been made to use Marxism this way in the analysis of gendered and racialized oppression, and a lot of that research has come out of left communist and communization circles. But disability has, again, remained conspicuous by its absence. I hope I have done at least something to elucidate what that approach might look like tonight, even if only negatively, and that it's given some ideas of how we may be able to build on that, or indeed if it's the right approach to take going forwards. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Luke. That was absolutely amazing. So much to think about. So I will open the floor for questions. Yeah, and yeah. So if you can, I will leave you yeah, a couple of some minutes to formulate your questions. Oh, great, Artie. Yeah, if you want to, yeah, please. Yeah, please.
Oh, hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your talk. I've been thinking about a lot of the same criticisms with this book. I was really glad that you mentioned the aspect about nursing homes. I'm doing some of my PhD research on that, and I definitely agree with you that that point is really important, that where value is actually being extracted from. Yeah, I don't think it's actually coming from the commodification of disabled people, but yeah, from the exploitation of nursing home workers, and also recirculation of through tax payments. Also, yeah, I guess I also had been thinking a lot about the category that they pose of the surplus. And yeah, I guess I felt confused throughout, like, reading Health Communism. Maybe because yeah, like you said, how expansive they pose it to be. But yeah, I guess I would agree with you that I'm not sure how helpful it is when we looking at the definition that Marx gives us. And I'm not familiar with the other author that you mentioned, so that was really helpful. I'll have to look that up. I think the other thing is that I noted, and maybe this is not important, but I guess something that was curious to me that I don't feel like was made explicit, and maybe someone has some answers, is I feel like the word disability and disabled is used very little in this book, and it's more like health and illness. And I'm just wondering if, what is the reason for that? And I guess I feel also, at least my, initial reading, is, even though it's, they make arguments about being against the medical model, I still feel like sometimes the focus on health with disability kind of being like implied, is kind of reproducing the medical model, at least from my perspective. And I feel, at the core of this, is very much the struggle, in the United States around Medicare for all. And even though, they talk about internationalism and they point to other cases, I still feel like, a lot of the other examples are given are, Anglophone, global North countries. And I just feel like ultimately it's a little bit US centric, with just the focus on healthcare. Like, it's strange to me because it seems to be like this contradiction, on the one hand saying that there's not not to be against the medical model, but then at the end it just seems like the solution is to have, there's some sentences where I feel like what the implication is that if there were healthcare, universal free healthcare for everyone, then disability oppression would be eliminated. And I feel like that is just very reductive, because it doesn't really address other aspects like employment. It doesn't address like the central problem of capitalism, which is exploitation, and how we're excluded from that. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Luke, would you like to respond to one question by one, or would you like to take more?
I'm very happy to go whichever way you want to take it, Ariana.
Or just what's easier for you? I think
okay, why don't I take a couple at once and reply to both of them?
couple of ones. Okay, great. So Joanna, if you want to go next.
Thank you, Luke, for a fantastic presentation. I have not read the book yet. Sitting on my shelf on my reading list, but I was just wondering from your presentation, I wonder if would it be fair to say that the book kind of reproduces a tragedy model of disability, because it's kind of, if the condition of disabled people worldwide is that they are being, value is extracted from them, and that's kind of it, then what role is there for agency and resistance? And then secondly, what would you say about the following line of argument in relation to kind of extraction? Would you agree that perhaps the extraction of value from care homes when it comes to disabled people who use services there is based on their active participation in those, so it's an extraction of their work, their unwaged work, which is active, which then, if we take that kind of conceptualization of their work, then that would place disabled people in the category of workers who are exploited beyond the wage. I'll stop there, thank you.
Okay, thanks, guys. So firstly, thank you for such great questions, and also thank you, Ari, for your really, really kind words. I'll start with the last one and go backwards, if that's cool. So in terms of extraction from work, so you're talking, Joanna, something like Weber's theory of exploitation as a whole, right? Where it's some kind of labor effort from somebody which I take advantage of, and that's how I exploit them. So in some cases, that almost certainly happens. The difficulty I have with that as a universal framing is, and I said one of my old job used to be kind of going around care homes and doing quality assessments and stuff. A lot of the time, not only is activity which we could call labor suppressed by the people who live there, activity which is bloody anything is suppressed, right? Like people are left in bed for days at a time. People are basically forced to sit, rotting away in front of the television when there's stuff that they wanted to do. So what I like about the UPIAS version of that, or the version which Paul Hunt and Ken Davis in particular came up with, is that it's about the suppression via controlling life opportunities, as opposed to by saying that somebody has to actually, put effort in for me to get better off by it. In fact, simply the fact that they are there and I can stop them from leaving really is what makes me better off. And that's how I don't know if you want to use the word extract, that's how I make my trust off of it, right? In relation to a tragedy model, I think it would probably be unfair to accuse Adler-Bolton and Vierkant of that. They do believe that kind of marginality or oppression naturally breeds resistance, and that the surplus can play a central role in class struggle in a way which I believe the phrase they use is elides the identity of the worker. So I don't think it's just tragedy. I do think it's an immiseration thesis. Basically, the old argument that the worse things get for people, the more likely they are to make revolution. I'm skeptical about that, but I think it's different than a tragedy model. Ari, bringing back in the medical model, I'm not sure that I would go so far as saying that. I think that the critique they make of the medical model, if we want to reframe it as that, is a very similar one to the one that Goffman made, which is, hang on a second here, this whole health medical thing, that's a social relationship, right? So we can't talk about these things as solely being about people's bodies or individual traits. We have to say, if we're trying to explain things through medicine and health, we really need to explain them through medicine and health as complicated and domineering social relationships, which operate at a number of levels. So I kind of think that that's okay. I think that there are critiques that were made of Goffman, by disabled activists and disabled movement theorists, which may apply to health communism in the same way that it applied to Goffman. I must admit, I haven't thought that through properly there, so I'm going to kind of leave that a bit up in the air. But I think, you know, being generous, I wouldn't accuse him of returning to a medical model. On methodological nationalism, you are absolutely right. And this is not something that I want to kind of pick anyone about, because I do it myself. We all kind of go, we're good internationalists, but then our model for how capitalism works as a whole is usually biased towards a decent explanation of the capitalist country we happen to live in. And that's not a unique Adler-Bolton and Vierkant problem. That's not a unique me problem. That's not even a unique Anglo problem. The French are really bad for this. So sorry, apologies to any French people in the room, but French theorists do this a heck of a lot when they start talking about capital. I think that's a problem to be got over, but I'm not in a position to look too closely at anybody else's nails on it, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks so much, Artie and Joanna, for two amazing questions, and Luke for amazing answers. Yeah, Blue, if you would like to go next, thanks.
I just had actually a really short comment rather than a question, which was, I think it's right to describe the book as kind of to addressing, or what's the word that you used was a correction, because I think that's what they say themselves, that they wrote the book as something they wished they'd found as a student. So I think that's quite a good description of it, the book being correction. And the second comment is, it's quite interesting that the book, that we all read something so US-centric when they spend so much time saying, I don't want to talk about insurances in the book, which is so key to, I guess, US-centric analysis. So I thought that was quite interesting that despite not talking about insurance, they end up talking a lot about US-centric models. So that's it.
Yeah, thanks, Blue. Ravi, if you would like to go next.
So mine is also mostly a comment rather than a question. I did put a comment in the chat, which is simply just flattery for Luke. I'm not going to repeat that here, although I would like a way to get a copy of this paper. I should start with a caveat. As you'll find out next month, my RA, Jacqueline Moiser, and I, we're doing a paper on Castoriadis. And I will confess to this group, I'm trained in law. I read volume 3 of Capital this year. So I think I'm operating in a different plane than Luke, and I found it outstanding. But having just read volume 3, and I don't claim to understand all of it, I'm curious in Luke's analysis whether he has a take, and I hope that's the right pronoun, on any of the debates. I'm thinking of the debates between Sweezy and Michael Roberts recently, because I mean, Marxism is a big camp. I'm working on Castoriadis, and there's people that are post-Marxist. There's people that have a very orthodox reading of the falling rate of profit, and different theories on Marxist crisis theory. And I was just curious because I won't be able to fully understand the paper until I actually get a physical copy. But I was curious if Luke comes down on a side in any of these modern debates on crisis theory, or is that does that intersect with the UPIAS's positions? That's it.
Okay, cool. So I'll start with that first. So firstly, what I have to say, Ravi, is you can see my copy of volume 3 behind me on the table. Most recently, I've only been using it for Russian twists. So you're doing significantly better than I am. On the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, I tend to be fairly orthodox on that. So Robert's position is closer to mine. I am very influenced by a Polish Marxist economist and a leader of the Polish Jewish Workers' Party in the 1900s and 1910s, a guy called Henryk Grossman, who had a kind of ultra-orthodox reading of that. I do think that that's reasonably well borne out. I must admit that I don't find Sweezy's counter-argument particularly convincing. However, I also don't think it matters for the UPIAS version of the relative surplus population. What's unique about UPIAS's revision to Marx is they go, okay, that may be true, that may not be true. This is how relative surplus populations as a whole kind of get bigger and arise. But when we look at disability exclusion, what we are really looking at is that kind of autonomist claim, that workerist claim about the technical composition. Really what's happening in workplaces, how power is structured, how the process of extracting value through machinery kind of comes out. And so for those people in Britain in the 70s, while some of them, they did read Capital, they sat down and they read it, and I'm sure they did have views on what the correct version of crisis theory is. It wasn't something which they which played into the theory particularly. You can have kind of whatever theory of crisis you want and still think the UPIAS position is right or wrong for whatever reason. It's kind of slightly outside of that. And I'm very happy to send you a copy of the paper, Ravi. That's no problem at all. Blue, on insurance, I mean, it's really interesting. I quite like their argument in Health Communism, that you take insurance for what it is, which is it's a financial mechanism. It's a way of getting money from one place to another. And that's kind of incidental either to where the money comes from or what is done with it. But I do accept a kind of slight reader's frustration, particularly in the parts of the book that I really enjoyed, which often were about, US specific or US dominant forms of health industry of some kind. That actually I was kind of thinking, well, if we just had this chapter as being in a bit more detail about the US case, I kind of feel like I'd come out of it with more insight. I don't know whether kind of somebody reading in a context which isn't Anglophone would necessarily have the same response as I did, or non-European would have the same response as I did. I kind of don't know. But I guess I kind of intuitively want to keep that let's discuss insurance as insurance kind of claim, even if I think that we need a rich picture of markets in order to begin to construct a kind of workable and operational analysis. But I realize I've just contradicted myself here, so I'll stop there before I do it again.
Yeah, thanks so much, Blue, Ravi, and Luke. Yeah, Nate, if you would like to go next, and then we can talk about whether we want a break and how long we want to keep going. Yeah, so Nate, please, thanks.
Great, thanks, Ariana. Thank you, Luke. Really good talk, really thought-provoking. I think I like the book more than you do, but it was really generative, and I appreciate the framing too of saying, hey, we're comrades and these issues are pressing, so we need to think about them. If I have some comments and maybe some suggestions for you, and I think they pertain to the network as a whole. I think the conversation about methodological nationalism and your remark right at the very end about the parts of the ultra left developing certain kinds of analyses and disability really being absent from that. I think there's also a relative unevenness of the distribution of the ultra left in the present in the Anglophone world. And I think partly this is a matter of we really are working in relatively, and you said this in the Q&A to some extent as well, we really are working in somewhat distinct national traditions of thinking about Marxism and about disability. And given what you've said here, I could imagine a really generative piece, kind of like analogous to some of what Perry Anderson has done in the Western Marxism work, but maybe less haughty, of like how did we come to be in this moment where we have this uneven distribution of starting points, and so I think it's very fair to say that this is a book that's fundamentally responding to what it's like to be in the US objectively in the kind of material conditions, but also I think this is fundamentally a book that arises from a series of US heavy theoretical and political resources and touchstones in a way that I think those of us who live in the US just have a hard time seeing. And so I think that, a piece that says, hey, let's situate as internationalists the somewhat distinct tradition so that we can sort of see ourselves, sort of get outside of ourselves to place ourselves in order to relate to comrades in different national traditions. I think that could be tremendously clarifying in a way that, the famous Marx line, we make history, but not in conditions of our own choosing. It's not enough to simply declare, well, in our hearts, we're internationalists, right? We have to really, and I think you brought this up really, really well in the Q&A. We have to think outside of the kind of objective imposition of of a kind of fragmented national traditions in order to not be kind of, what's the word, kind of parochial or ethnocentric about our own conditions. So I think that's been really generative, and I've gotten a lot out of the talk and the discussion from that. I wanted to push a little bit on two parts of the talk. So one, not a push, but you said you were talking through, you were saying, here's the things I can imagine the worker surplus binary meaning. I read a third meaning, and I'm reading this into the text because I agree with you that I wish the text was much more Marxological and had a lot more capital and so on, but we have to take it as it is. I read that the discussion of surplus and worker as, and I think this is in Marx in chapter 25 of volume 1 of Capital, that there are some people who get access to sufficient amounts of money to reproduce their current situation. And that's the working class. Those are the workers, so to speak. Everybody's the proletariat. One part of the proletariat can do that now. And then there are these large sections in, the various typology, the floating, the latent, the stagnant, the paupers, in chapter 25, of people who can't reproduce their current situation via the labor market. And so I read the book as really about people for whom labor markets are not reproductive institutions. And I take your point that situating in the surplus for moral purposes and for validity is a questionable strategy. But I think that's just a slightly different, maybe you disagree. Maybe that falls under one of your categories, but to my mind, I didn't hear, maybe I just misunderstood the point, but I heard in your account of the book just a different reading of that category than what I got. And I got it as essentially the worker surplus binary is do you encounter the labor market as reproductive, or do you encounter yourself as needing supplements in order to be reproduced because the labor market won't reproduce you? So that was how I understood that category in the book. And then the final thing, and I'll shut up. I'm not familiar with UPIAS's work other than what you provided here, so I maybe missed some nuance. But in the slide, you talked about the technical composition as determining the position of the surplus population. I disagree with that, and I'd be happy to talk more about that if you want to. I don't want to take us too far afield, but I would say very quickly, I think it's the domination of the value composition. The fact that the technical composition is organized by value composition is what produces the expulsion of people. So the technical composition is dynamic because of the valorization process over time. So technical factors are subordinated to value production. I will also, and I feel terrible doing this, I'll point to my own scholarship, which there's no reason anyone should have heard of. In the early 20th century, the introduction of workers' compensation laws involved no changes to the technical composition of capital, and in both the United States and the United Kingdom, pushed a great deal of previously acceptably physically impaired people out of the workplace. And so that's a really clear example, at least in one instance, of where it's not the technical composition that determines employability, but more like I would say the legal structuring of the value composition. Sorry to go on. Your talk was really thought-provoking. Please take the sort of avalanche of thoughts as evidence of it being a really, really great talk.
No, thanks, Nate. So just to try and intervene on those in ways which I hope are kind of clarifying. So if we start with the worker surplus binary as a function of reproduction through labor power, now that's what I think happens, right? Like that's what I think the difference between surplus populations and non-surplus populations basically is. I found that difficult to square with the claim that health constitutes capital by quasi-legitimating forms of non-labor. That would be my problem. So keeping their arguments around health and around surplus broadly kind of parallel. I don't think they're the same argument, but I think they have to be parallel in some sense. Read to me is incompatible with that claim. But of course, in general, that's what surplus populations are, in Marx and Engels and in me, because I haven't had any better ideas yet. On the technical composition of capital and the organic composition of capital, of course, the technical composition and the organic composition are the same thing described under two different names. But depending on which aspect we're looking at or in which framework we're looking at it in, they will reveal to us different dynamics of capitals, kind of crisis tendencies, expansion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if I put that the technical capital determines the surplus population as a whole on the slide, that's because I'm a fool and I'm very sorry, and that was a typo. And thanks for pointing it out. UPIAS's position, as I read it and understand it, it is not that, it's that the technical composition renders disabled people as either the worst parts of the reserve army of labor or spread across the surplus population, depending on where you are, regardless of whether the organic composition of capital has risen to such a point that it's led to a crisis tendency entailing unemployment. So it's kind of disability oppression. In practice, it runs along with surplus populations as a whole, but it is a residual and much more entrenched category, even if one which dynamically can have outcomes spread across the surplus population. Is that slightly clearer, or have I just waffled?
No, it's great. And I checked, it's slide number 12, and it's a nuanced point that I may have misread the nuance of because I'm only taking it in now. But thank you for that. Very thought-provoking, as was the whole talk.
Yeah, thanks, Nate, for the great questions and Luke for the great answers. So, yeah, I was wondering, so I have a question, but I was wondering, I think there was a big confusion in terms of the times. So I was wondering if people would like to finish at 8, so in 15 minutes, because people come from all over the world. So do people want to finish in 15 minutes, which would be 1.5 hours, which I think is what we did last time? Or do we want to keep going for 3/4 of an hour? So in that case, maybe we want to have a break. So yeah, so apologies for the confusion. Yes, I don't know what people would like to do. Just to know whether we want to add a break now or not. Okay. Oh, Anne, thanks. I agree. Oh, okay. Okay, cool. So yeah, so please, any questions, please just send them in, so we can. Okay, yeah. Okay, amazing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So So thanks so much. Oh, James. Oh, you go first. I don't want to abuse my role. So please go on.
So I thought the talk was excellent, and I think it's a really useful situation of the debates here. I agree with Luke on the defense of the UPIAS tendency and the kind of classical Marxist interpretation. I've read some of Health Communism. I found it a little bit inscrutable at points and sort of gave up after a bit because I had other things to do. But I did think that there were a couple of questions that it still raised for me. One of which is their definition of the commodity, which I don't really feel makes sense in quite a lot of ways, because a commodity to Marx and within classical Marxism is an object produced to be sold. If their argument is that disabled people are commodities, then they're arguing that disabled people are produced to be sold, which seems quite contradictory to their view of the way in which health is constructed under capitalism and the construction of the care sector as profitable through financialization. And I think that's a really, really a big problem within that schema from a kind of perspective of any kind of Marxist view of political economy. And a more realistic view is that disabled people do enter into capital through care as raw materials to be worked upon, if we want to look at it in that way. But the service being sold is care itself in any kind of profitable exchange, whether profitable or not, actually, in any kind of market exchange there. And possibly that we could say that the financialized bonds and so on and so forth are also sold, but that is in the end a way of shuffling money around and speculation on future profits. Secondly, I do wonder if there is a more interesting kind of meeting point that might be possible between the UPIAS tendency or the classical kind of Marxist tendency within disability studies and what's argued here by an observation of the way in which Marx constructs health within capital. So I'm thinking of a very particular part of capital where he's discussing the role played by miners and why those kind of workers receive higher wages relative to those in less kind of intensive industries. And one point he raises is that it's because they expend more of their life force within production, and therefore the capitalist is buying future reproduction of labor that hasn't actually occurred yet, and that cuts their lives shorter and so on and so forth, which provides a social reason for that advanced wage and that reproduction as well. But I wonder if that might allow us to move toward a kind of way of constructively engaging the two critiques.
So firstly, the point on the commodity is absolutely no less than I expect from you, James. And thank you for making it. I'm more forgiving than you are on that point. I guess returning to the point of, I don't necessarily want to attack anybody's argument for not being sufficiently Marxist enough in kind of all regards. I just want to look at where they attempt to depart from what appear to be concepts relevant to our shared project here around disablement, and see whether they do better than us, basically. I would still want to defend something like the claim that by making the actual ownership of these companies, industries, homes, facilities, kind of whatever, by making those tradable as financial assets, you do still have a form of commodification. And also, you know, when you look at the way that commissioning works through municipal councils in Britain or in Germany or Austria or whatever, these things are described in terms of commodity. They're described in terms of exchange value. They're described in terms of kind of quantification, et cetera, in ways that I just feel kind of commodification is too useful a term to really get rid of. On the convergence, the way that Marx talks about the construction of health, I in principle want to do that. And in principle, I kind of want to talk about, as in fact, Adler-Bolton and Vierkant do in the book, the social murder claims, but also the factory inspectors reports that Marx makes much of in Capital, where he talks about, you know, the factory inspectors say that to be able to live a decently long life, workers will need a certain amount of space, a certain amount of clean air, and a certain amount of nutrition, and yet capital is incapable of providing them. I think that's generative. On the miners point, I read that bit in Marx as being a kind of ironic shift around of Adam Smith, so I think I took it less seriously than you. Smith uses a very similar example to argue something which ends up with a similar cash value, but which doesn't go around the houses to critique capital quite as much as Marx does. I would probably need to go back and reread that and try and take it as not ironic, and then get back to you with more substantive thoughts on that than those I can offer now. So sorry about that, James.
Yeah, thanks, James, for a great question, and Luke for a great answer. And there is, Luke, there is in the Nicola had asked a question which, apologies, I had missed, and I have just pasted, so you can, I can read it out loud, or it's in the chat. So yes, I will read it. So Nicola asks, do you think that disability oppression partially operates by forcing some disabled people with invisible disabilities and impairments to mask pass and be invisible as disabled in the workforce? Not to make a fuss, get on with it, not ask for special treatment, just get on with it, and receive no adjustments, create profits for the bosses, and be extra exploited on that basis. I'd be interested in this dimension. And I'm coming from the distinct British perspective right through the DDA to the War on Disabled People Welfare Reform to today. Sorry for reading it badly, but yeah.
No, that's fine. So is there a distinct form of oppression which is making us mask that we're less impaired than we are in the workplace, and getting some extra benefit for our bosses from the fact that we're potentially really worried about being able to find other work, or disablism within unemployment benefits or what have you? That's definitely real. Like, that definitely exists. And it's horrible. Like, firsthand, it's pretty disgusting. And I know it's a hell of a lot worse for people whose impairments are much more fluctuating than mine is, right? So yeah, that's absolutely a form that it takes. It's interesting, isn't it, that even even though I would still argue that the root of our oppression comes from exclusion from labor, there are all kinds of wily ways that bosses manage to actually eke extra benefit out from us, you know, through things like this, through the fear, through the fact that actually, shit, I really do need this job, right? In a way that maybe my non-disabled co-worker doesn't. And that's something which, again, I think we owe a debt of gratitude to Adler-Bolton and Vierkant for pointing out, that actually the people who are characterized as drains often do provide a service to those who make a living by exploitation. Now, I mean, I think that the way that that's done is slightly broader than that described in the book, and Nicola, you've outlined one very clear way in which that happens. But again, I think that that framework that they, or that impulse that they lay down for us to look for that is helpful and that is useful. I hope that answers your question, Nicola.
Yeah, thanks so much, both Nicola and Luke. And there is in the chat, Aaron, a question. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself or you would like me to read it, or Luke, if you want. Okay, I can.
If you could, I'm on my little screen, so the chat bar is
yes,
just
absolutely, yes. So yes, I'll read it. So also, so Aaron writes, also with 4 at alongside Nicola, I found this paper by Aberli, and there is a link, to be particularly interesting in that not only does it get on with it, there is an element of shame, blame, stigma that acts as a social control element. Yeah, I don't know if you want to. Yeah.
No, I mean that absolutely right. Like misfortunes hunt in packs, right? Like, there's never just one thing which is kind of miserable and exploitative. Not only do you really need the job and need to keep your head down, if you stick your head up, not only are you going to have the same discipline as other workers when you're in a much worse position to deal with it, you're also going to get that, oh, you know, you whiny, you're not really whatever it is, you look fine, blah blah blah, all this stuff. So yeah, like that's absolutely true. I think that's completely correct.
Yeah, okay, so any question? Otherwise I will ask one myself, but if there are more questions.
Go on, Ariana, treat yourself.
Oh yeah, that was such an amazing paper, and it was so much above any. So I will need to, yeah, if there is a paper, I will just want to read it. Just because I think it was, I really loved how it really engaged with the Marxist side of health communism, which and took them on their own terms, and while comparing with the UPIAS argument and their strengths, just to see how the two fared. So and I love the critique as well as generosity with which you approach the comparison. So I think for me, so I have many questions, but maybe a couple of points that I was wondering what you think about in terms how, well, the first is whether you think that there is scope for actually combining the two frameworks, the two Marxist frameworks of health communism and UPIAS to maybe to complement some of the dimensions that you were drawing attention to, for example, the issue of the technical composition and the position, the marginal position of disabled people in relation to that specific dimension. So whether you see that actually it could be there could be an integration of the two frameworks, or whether you think that their starting points are do not really allow that. And the second, so I think that was a question. And the second, which I think connects to many of the questions that have been asked, was yeah, so relates to the idea that health is capitalism's vulnerability, which is the very bold claim that from the start I was struggling with, like many people, and that I think your paper was really helpful in helping me get my head around to the claim. I'm still struggling with it, to be honest, just because I just still have this barrier whereby I cannot really, I can't, just because of the social construction of health under capitalism, I really struggle seeing how seeing the demand for health for all can be revolutionary just from a disability from the perspective of disability politics, and from so I really so thank you, because you've helped me get my hand around to the claim that is central to health communism and that I really struggle with. So I was wondering, with that claim, how do you feel, how do you think that claim can be operationalized by disabled people's movement, for example, in the UK, or those of us involved in welfare struggles? So how do you blend that demand of health, or healthcare for all is more, but with all its caveats about social control, but how do you operationalize that that demand? How do you translate that into practice? Yes, thank you. And just answer what is useful and leave out all the
no, thank you. So I'm going to sound, you know, the old joke about the guy walking down the country road and he gets stopped and asked for directions, and he replies, well, I wouldn't have started from here. So I guess for me, I think health is not something that I would want to make into a kind of foundational claim for movements, so like a foundational demand framework for movements. I can see why Adler-Bolton and Vierkant do, and I think that they pose an interesting question in terms of, actually, this is, even as a social construct, right? There are individual interests in certain aspects of this that will always be contested from the bottom up. And I think that's interesting. And I think that can be very helpful in individual welfare struggles, where I think often we still think of health, even, you know, those of us who are good and kind of radical and believe in things being social creations and stuff like that, we still think of it as a very kind of rarefied area of expertise. And like it is, right? Like it absolutely is. But we also know the things which make us miserable and unhealthy. And I think it's often worth thinking about those when we try and think up demands within social movements, as opposed to just often we rely on the art of the possible or on like the quantifiable, right? So I'm kind of tempted to go, well, look, that's really, really useful, but I wouldn't necessarily want to make all health for all people into an operationalizable social movement claim, partially because like I have the same difficulties you do with it, I think. And also like there are others which I find kind of equally, if not more, interesting as frameworks. I mean, I'm afraid to say I'm old-fashioned and I'm a freedom guy. When it comes to, I'm so sorry, the first part of your question referred to,
yeah, whether it's possible to integrate
melding.
Yeah.
So I think it is. I wouldn't necessarily start with the value composition or the technical composition on the one hand and health as an excluding variable on the other. I think I would start where I'd see the greatest degree of landing ground, or more selfishly, where I think that the analysis that we put forward has something really to learn from health communism, is in the analysis of the private sector as constitutive, as like something which constitutes states and constitutes states' positions. Now, I think that the version of that in health communism can be overstated and occasionally is overstated. But I think it's definitely true that the state has turned setting up private markets in welfare services in general, but disability services in particular, into its own form of statecraft. And it's also very clear that it uses this as a form of geopolitical power. Although, again, I think we can overstate the case for that. That would be where I think I would want to build a kind of a landing ground for us to go in the same direction and build off each other's insights in the immediate term, because I think those are pressing problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks so much for these two amazing answers. They're really helpful because, yeah, like I was saying, I've been struggling on this session. Your presentation was mind-blowing, and also the discussion afterwards. It's really helpful for me in making sense of this, I agree, very important book, but really difficult to digest and square with where I'm coming from. So thanks so much, Luke, for this amazing presentation and discussion. And yeah, so does anyone have further questions? Or you are very welcome to use the list to get in touch with Luke and to keep the conversation, to continue the conversation. Okay, yeah. Oh yes, yes. Sorry, one last point. Yeah, Joanna, I don't know if you or Paul, if you would like to say something about the mailing list. So before that, a big thank you to Luke for this fantastic presentation and session, and to everyone for coming. And yeah, it's been really wonderful.